I'm Billy Showell and I'm going to show you how to paint an apple portrait in watercolour. I've already drawn the apple up, so let's get going. For this study I'm going to use a number 6 sable. Start off by making a lovely big puddle in the middle of cadmium red deep, and then we'll add to that some alizarin crimson. There are several glazes to go onto this apple, but we're going to start off by getting it as dark as possible so that we can get as much colour on the first wash. And now we're going to add some French ultramarine. The French ultramarine will give it this lovely deep red colour. I'm just going to add a little bit of yellow to that, just so it doesn't dry too browny. And then we're going to add a little bit of permanent rose as well, just so it's not too yellowy. So several colours in that mix. And then there's some lighter colour at the top of the apple, which I'm going to use cadmium yellow pale and a little bit of permanent rose. So the first stage is always to glaze the apple. To put a nice big glaze of water. Try and keep the glaze clean. What we're going to do is put the colour on around the highlights as opposed to trying to lift them off. This is quite a good technique for maintaining the white of the paper, which gives you that lovely shine on the apple. Try and bring the water down the page as though you were doing a flat colour wash. It's easier to keep the glaze even across the apple. Just coming just within the pencil line there. Okay, just wet the brush, take the excess out, really lift the colour up onto the brush. Take a little moment just to have a look at the apple and decide which highlights are the important ones to maintain, and let the paint drop onto the apple, giving that lovely soft cotton wool edge. This always looks terribly frightening in the beginning, but once you get used to doing it, it's not so scary. The far right hand edge of the apple has got a lovely reflected highlight up from the paper. We're going to try and keep that. This is often referred to as the disappearing edge, as it disappears around the corner. And it's the light that's bouncing back onto the apple that we're going to try and maintain. At the moment everything's very wet and moving quite freely around the apple. When the paint's moving softly over the apple, we can sort of relax while it's mushing across the surface, and then this is the bit where we have to speed up. What I'm doing now is I've dried the brush out and it's sort of slightly damp. We've taken a little bit of the water out and we're hoovering up the excess paint. What this also does is soften the edge, so you can see that all those little spidery marks now are being swept away, giving the apple a lovely smooth appearance. Just before it starts to dry, I'm going to drop in the brighter colour, which is this lovely bright orangey colour, just for the top part of that apple there, and a little streak of brightness down this side. Just lift out where you see these highlights. It's a damp brush rather than a wet one. If you put a wet brush onto this settling glaze, you will end up with a mess because it will pull all the colour, push all the colour to the edge. Try not to interfere around the highlights because they'll stay nice and soft from the wet on wet. What I'm doing now is just very gently stroking the colours together just to get them to merge nicely on the paper. I'm going to sweep out a nice crest highlight through the top there and pull the brush through that so it's not a great big line. Just go through that again, push the brush against the paper, flatten the brush and sweep through. Another little lift around the edge. There's some nice reflected light on the underneath. All this light will give the apple form. Once you start leaving a streak when you put your brush to the paper, that's the time to stop because the paint will become too dry to lift off and give you a nice soft glow. And when you've got to that stage, you sit back and let it dry. The first glaze has dried now, so I've removed the pencil and we can get on with the second layer of colouring. I've got the original puddle of colour here, which has got several reds in it, and I'm just going to add a little bit more permanent rose to make it really, really bright. So I've added the permanent rose and a little bit more French ultramarine. And we're going to go for quite a pinky wash on this next one. Give your brush a good wash. And then glaze exactly the same area again, the whole apple from top to bottom. People are often a bit frightened about doing this because they think all the paint's going to come off, but if it's completely dry, it shouldn't do. It should be permanent. Dry your brush off so that you're not going to water down the colour that you've mixed. Hoover it all up into the brush. And be very selective now. You're just going to put it where you need the most intense shots of colour, right the way through the middle there. Around the side. You'll need to go back to the puddle several times because it does use up an awful lot of paint. Just let it flow off the brush and onto the paper. It's a good idea not to interfere with the colour when you first put it on. Just let it move around on its own. Give you a really nice deep colour, uninterrupted. A little bit more around the side here. You can also put a little bit more of the lemon and pink into it as well. So a little bit brighter on the top there, just get a nice shine of juicy colour across the top. So let it all settle and then see where you need to lift out your highlights again, because it'll move into your areas of highlight. So you just need to sweep that away. You can see how the colour's really starting to get quite nice and intense now. That's what you're after. The area at the back of the apple there is quite important. There's quite a strong highlight. Try and get a nice sweep on the brush when you're lifting out highlights again. Try and get it all done in one go on one area. So it's coming all the way around that crescent at the top. You'd see the areas where we haven't put any paint are still quite nice and bright. That's what we want to try and maintain, to really keep a nice shiny apple. Sweep through there, really push the brush against the paper and really lift out all that colour. When you come back to lift these highlights out, really take the water right out of the brush so that it's going to mop up all the colour. I'm just going to add a little bit more French ultramarine into that glaze, because as it's settling we've got a little window that we can just drop in some much darker colour to where it gets really dark. Underneath here, we're just going to plop it on, just gentle dabbing motion of the brush, and you'll see how it's still wet enough to spread, giving you a much darker area down here and a little bit darker around there, and that'll make the disappearing edge seem even brighter with some nice dark next to it, and a little bit darker over the other side. Being a little bit careful now, because as you come up to the top of the apple, so it's going to be drying out, so it won't be quite so soft. I'm just going to get some nice dark along the back there. Very carefully, just with a flattened brush, just tease some of that colour down into the centre of the apple. A little bit over the edge here. What we're trying to do is create shape as well, so you want to try and take your brush over the top in the same direction as the markings. Just chiseling the brush there just to get a nice little bit of texture through there. Obviously not with a wet brush, otherwise that could cause all sorts of problems for you. Damp brush now, very gently, just getting rid of these little spidery marks where the colours have been mushing together down the bottom. Very gently just soften those in. A little bit of retention of light round there. And that's our second glaze done.